See, I was chattering a little bit to try to manage the time. Now half an hour is easy to keep for me on the clock, okay? So 11:15, so let's go. So this first presentation has to do with a study that Martin, myself, and a colleague from Kuwait University, Mohammed Sartawi, we did a couple of years back on science, culture, and worldviews funded by the Kuwaiti Science Foundation. Do you remember the correct name? KFAS, the Kuwaiti Foundation for the Advancement of Science. Okay, we were commissioned to do the study to look at how people engage with science and their behaviors, right, in everyday life, and in particular examine two challenges. One was the vaccine uptake in Kuwait, which, like other countries, was abysmal, right? It was a bit of a worry when a government announces, you know, we finally gotten the vaccine, come take it before it expires, and people don't show up because they've got their own ideas of what the vaccine is doing and so on and so forth. So a social representation that is different from the one that the government is using to try to regulate the conduct of its citizens. And the second big problem that they seem to have in Kuwait, that they were very concerned with, is health behaviors that have to do with, you know, a very high incidence of coronary heart disease, a very high incidence of diabetes. And so there's these health challenges that the Kuwaiti government is also concerned with. And we were roped in to study science culture and why people, because it seems to be the case that in certain jurisdictions, a certain population will have, you know, more welcoming attitudes to science news and science information, and it's more prone than other jurisdictions to take on the advice of scientific advisors and so on and so forth. Whereas elsewhere, people, you know, will be skeptical and they will disregard science, and this comes with its own consequences, right? So this was the idea. And we're trying to study this science culture, so what people do in Kuwait and what influences this doing. Now, with regards to social representations in particular, the one big question that we brought into this study is this notion of worldviews, because we wanted to try to understand one question that has emerged in social representations research, goes back to my colleague Martin Bauer. What determines the stickiness of a particular representation? So the whole idea of social representations is that a particular object, whatever it is, nuclear technology, democracy, whatever that object is, will have different understandings, right? Psychoanalysis. The Catholics make one sense of it, the liberals are making a different sense of it. Okay, now what determines which social representation sticks? Is it a function of the social representation itself? Is it a function of the mind that is processing that representation? In all likelihood, it has something to do with both, right? Because it's a social psychology dynamic, right? A social psychological dynamic. So probably involves these two elements. So what we brought into this study, aside from the culture of science indicators, was this notion of worldviews here. Now, I don't want to spend too much time telling you about this. I had done some previous research with a colleague who I should mention here, Professor Sergio Salvatore, from the University of Salento. There's a lot of literature out there that has something to say about how people process information, right, around them. So Sergio Salvatore proposed the notion of symbolic universes, right? But there's others, okay? There's moral frameworks, for instance, from Jonathan Haidt. There's social axioms from Lung and Bond. There's deep stories from Holt. There's 5 different conflict resolution strategies from Thomas and Killman. There's a Fisk as well, who proposes 4 relational styles. So there's a whole bunch of literature that has been working separately in trying to understand how human beings engage the world around them, as it were, or experience the world around them, right? That seems to have identified and converged on 5 different types, this typology of 5. Now, I didn't question this, okay? Can there be more than 5? In all likelihood. It's a little bit like personality, right? The Neo-PR tells us there's 5 dimensions. You go to China, you find 7. Okay, happens, right? So these kinds of questions we haven't strictly resolved. But we've taken these 5 different worldviews and brought them to bear on this particular topic of a culture of science in a particular locale in Kuwait. And I want to work my way towards giving you a bit of an overview of the findings here, because I think they're very insightful. So let me settle the issue of the 5 worldviews and what they are without spending too much time. I'm going to do it in a nutshell, okay? So imagine you walk into a bar and you want to order a drink, right? And whilst you're kind of trying to make space and waiting and that kind of thing, 5 lads come along and they're, you know, having fun, and it's a group of 5 and they're coming. And you're the psychologist, so obviously you make space, and instead of ordering your drink, you start observing the lads, right? And so this is how it goes. The first lad goes, hey, listen guys, we need to do something here because, you know, for us to get anything out of life, we have to work for it, okay? We have to put in the effort, so we can't just hold back. We need to find a way to make our voices heard. That's the worldview, right? Striving for reward, trying to get, you know, a reward on the effort that one puts in. The second one, the friend goes, listen, no matter how hard the effort you put in life, life's a bitch, you know, and it's got a way of grinding you down, a bit of a pessimistic outlook. Even if we try, we're not necessarily going to get the outcome. The third one goes, yeah, true, life is very difficult, you know, but we need to find a way to work around the rules and make the rules work for us, huh? Because otherwise we're not going to get anywhere. We might have to cut a few corners. The fourth one goes, hey, listen guys, but you know, yeah, we need to make the rules work for us, but let's focus on good vibes, okay? We don't want to be cutting the rules and then causing problems with the atmosphere in the pub. We need to get along with everyone else. The fifth worldview will go, listen guys, you know, we can't start breaking the rules because otherwise, you know, the whole thing will disintegrate, and instead of having a drink, we'll end up in a fight. So we don't want disorder in this setting. We want to, you know, abide by the rules and follow the rules for a harmonious coexistence. That, in a nutshell, is these 5 different worldviews. Now, we've got them in the papers that we've published. If you want to read further on them, right, the idea, these are the 5 different types, and this is how we measure them. We had a vignette for each, and that we asked people then, to what extent do you agree or disagree, and which one comes closest to your views. So this is what we were looking at, and then we proceeded to ask, right, the various worldview, the various culture of science indicators, sorry. So worldviews as a predictor of everything else that we were studying. Now, do these worldviews have something to do with how people are appraising policy and making sense of policy and how they are participating in the social domain? So we did 2 tasks in the study, right? The first one was we analyzed documents that were out there. Think about it, right? Think about any policy that you want enacted in society, right? Whatever it is that you want to do. Say you want to provide free childcare, right? On the state or something like this. You're going to go out there, you're going to communicate it, you've got one shot. You can't go to every citizen and try to have a conversation with them. You're going to publish a policy document, or you're going to publish a law, and you're going to communicate it out there. What the citizens on the receiving end are going to make out of it, well, that has something to do with who they are, not necessarily what you're saying, right? So you're communicating something, and this is being received on the other end, and this dynamic that we wanted to study. So the first thing we did was look at what the Kuwaiti government is making available to its citizens. We took 2 domains of inquiry, right? The environment and health policies that are communicated by the government. And then we tried to analyze how these were being received by opinion leaders, that is the media. What sense was being made out of them? So what we did was we coded official policy by these worldview types, and then we took representative samples of the discussion that was happening in the media, and we coded the same to see if there was a mismatch. Was it the case that the government was promoting one worldview and the media was passing judgment from a different kind of worldview, right? And we did the same for health policy and the health media. You won't find much discussion of the health media because the only topic that people were discussing at the time was COVID and how to process that kind of information, and the COVID was dominated by these localized concerns. How are we going to survive? Okay, all of us together. Not how we're going to make money, not how we're going to advance in society, nor anything like a highest value or something like this. But one thing that emerges straight away from this analysis is that there's a mismatch between what the government is saying and how it's being reported. Okay? So the public is facing information from the government that is painting a picture in one particular way. The media, when communicating what the government is doing to the public, because this is how you hear about the new laws, this is how you hear about the policy, you read about it on the news. The news is spinning it in a different direction. The chi-square shows that the differences between these two domains are significant. So now the big question is, where does the public sit with this? We did a survey with 1,400 people all together in Arabic and English. We were measuring worldviews and then culture of science indicators, and we also asked them the prevalence of worldviews. Now, here's the first problem that we encountered, a resonance problem. The distribution of worldviews amongst the public does not mirror the distribution of worldviews in the documents, nor does it mirror the distribution in the media. So the public have a different outlook. So here's the resonance problem. If the government is trying to convince the citizens that whatever, blue technology, coronavirus vaccines, and so on and so forth, is a good idea for this kind of reason, well, this is not as well represented amongst the public, or for this kind of reason. Look at that, the media, 57%, because most people are actually thinking along different lines. Most people are reacting and they're sensitive to some other kind of frame, okay? So this is how they're processing this information, and it doesn't align very well. So there's a little bit of a mismatch here. So then we wanted to take a deeper look at the effect of these particular worldviews and how people were orienting themselves to science in itself, right? So what we find already so far is that there's a mismatch between the public and the government. Government is promoting one particular version of the world, the people have a different version of the world, so it's hard to make sense of what the government is saying, right? Okay, now, are there differences between the worldviews? Do worldviews matter in all of this, okay? So, okay, at this point, then we got the quantitative data, we sat down, we ran the analysis, and we got a blank, okay? Like, no significant effects whatsoever. And that's the point where I crashed and started pulling my hair and panicking, you know, and I wrote to my colleagues and I said, game over, we're out of business. And Martin has been doing this for ever, right? So he said, okay, Gordon, don't panic, man, this is just step one, okay? Think about it a little bit more. There's a lot of noise out there because a lot of people are not engaged with science in Kuwait. So that means that on the culture of science indicators, they're ranking very low because they're completely disengaged. What if you filter out those who are disengaged and look only at those who are engaged? Do worldviews make a difference on that level? So amongst people who don't care, the worldviews don't matter. Amongst people who care, do the worldviews matter amongst people who care? Yes. That's where we get the significant findings. So amongst people who care, somehow, even just a tiny little bit, the worldviews demonstrate both between worldview differences as well as within worldview differences. Let me just sum it up and then you can read about it in a paper. There's an open access paper that we've published on these findings if you want to get into the detail, but the narrative goes like this, okay? There's an effort to mobilize people to get them engaged with a particular issue. Let's say coronavirus, you want to get them engaged with the vaccine, okay? Do you observe different? Once they're engaged, there are going to be differences between the worldviews. Some worldviews will be sympathetic to the COVID vaccine effort. Some worldviews will not be sympathetic. They will resist it, okay? So there are differences between the worldviews. Some worldviews are more prone to agree, some worldviews are more prone to disagree. Within the worldviews, so if you look, for instance, at the pragmatist worldview on its own, or the survivor worldview on its own, you will find differences between those who demonstrate a high interest and those who demonstrate a low interest. You will find those differences with regards to the culture of science indicators. The take-home message here is this, right? You'll find that when you make an effort as a policy maker to engage citizens on a particular issue. I'll give you an example here. This is probably the best example. You will find that once you activate that interest is filtered by the worldview that the subject has. Some of them will develop, for instance, as a function of the effort, a higher reserve towards science. Some others will develop a lower reserve towards science. So what that means is, nothing's happening, people don't care. Worldviews don't make any difference whatsoever. You try to engage the citizens by informing them, by sending people to their home, by sending brochures, by doing a media campaign, and you get their interest somehow. Once you get their interest, some of them will go one way, some of them will go another way. By virtue of how they're framing the communication that's coming from you with regards to the topic in question. So this is basically how disagreements are arising in the collective space, right? And that tells us something about how social representations are being contested as a matter of course by virtue of the diversity that exists out there, that has something to do with how people are processing information according to their worldviews. So which social representation sticks? Okay, that might not be a matter of the social representation in itself. It might have to do with how the social representation is framed and how the distribution of worldviews exists amongst a citizenry. Now that is it from my end. I'll just conclude by giving you the paper that we published on this. It's available in Research and Politics and it's open access if you want to read about it further. What I want to do for the next presentation is hand over to Martin to elaborate a little bit at this difference between these kind of higher order variables that we study across different societies and their then manifestation in particular locale. Over to you, Martin.
I think we should have some questions. Yeah, thank you.
How do you want? It's a full presentation.
No, let's have some questions.
Sure.
Let's have some questions.
Yeah, sure.
Just that talk.
Yeah.
About the gender differences.
Gender differences. Ah, that's an interesting one. Okay, so here's what's interesting about it. The socio-demographics don't work as well, and their statistical power is less than the worldviews. So there were some very slight gender differences, not across the board, but pertaining only to particular culture of science variables or particular worldviews, but not across the board. One variable that surprised us, I was meant to say it before handing over to Martin, was religiosity. Anywhere else that we studied worldviews, religion, religious affiliation, comes out as a predictor. Religious affiliation is typically associated with an orthodox worldview that is a dogmatic worldview. I'll give you an example from my research in Malta when we introduced recreational cannabis. 51 NGOs signed a petition that went all the way to Parliament to try to stop the legislation. Those 51 NGOs were all Catholic. Everyone else, they didn't care about recreational cannabis because the thinking about the public was, you know, I don't smoke it, so who cares? If they want to smoke it, it's up to them. I don't particularly care. But the orthodox ones, subscribing to a particular religion, had an objection. In Kuwait, because we think everyone is highly Muslim, because the society is highly Muslim, then religiosity in itself didn't have an effect. We are encouraged by the fact that the worldviews in themselves are now proving themselves to be as good predictors as the socio-demographics. Why does that happen? I'll speculate. I think maybe in a world where we have more access to information and where there's less social disparities than there were maybe 50 years ago, 100 years ago, maybe the socio-demographics don't matter quite as much anymore as psychodemographics. Maybe it's time to start thinking about them. Worldviews might be one way to do that.
Thanks a lot.
And it's the same for the age.
Yes, exactly. It didn't exercise an influence across the board.
Okay.
No socio-demographics exercised an influence across the board. We couldn't make sense of the. We couldn't tease out any pattern. So I'm not able to tell you that. Listen, amongst this particular age group, there's this kind of tendency.
Okay.
It varies. by issue, it's unpredictable.
Okay.
Okay.
More questions? No, we have time for
Sorry,
questions.
I didn't
have a
realize.
question. For the world views like that we categorized, I'm going to ask you what was the theoretical basis for choosing those topics? I mean, those categorical that you mentioned.
So we're getting this out of, it's a synthesis of 3 distinct literatures, 4. Come on. After we've done the 4, I've identified a 5th. The first one is symbolic universes. These were identified in a European study out of the views of context questionnaire. So asking people what they think about, life in general and that kind of thing. And this study, through a factor analysis, identified 5 factors that have to do with the affective experiences in everyday life. So affect. Then you have the moral foundations from Jonathan Haidt, who also identified 5 different categories of morals, though. And the third big literature here is social axioms by Lung and Bond. And these are kind of philosophical beliefs. So what seems to be happening here is that the morality side of things identifies 5. The affect literature identifies 5. The cognition literature identifies 5. So these are 5 worldviews that incorporate an ethical dimension, a cognitive dimension, and an experiential dimension. And we're bringing that literature together in developing these vignettes. But it doesn't end there. We then did studies in the lab, in the cognitive lab, and what we found is that these worldviews are underpinned by some social values. You know Schwarz's circumplex of different social values? There's 2 social values that underlie the difference between these worldviews. One of them is the value of conservatism and openness to change. The other value, and they seem to work orthogonally, the other value is self-transcendence versus self-enhancement. So deontological ethics versus utilitarian ethics. And the worldviews position themselves in these 4 quadrants, except for the survivor worldview. The survivor worldview is a little bit in the middle towards the conservative end. So it seems to be the fallback of these other 4. If you look at Fiske's relational models, they also map onto these 2 dimensions orthogonally, if you look at them like this. So what we're doing now, we've got a study underway, I'm gathering data now. We want to develop a way to typify these worldviews, not on the basis of vignettes, because that doesn't give you much statistical power. What we want to do is develop an algorithm by which you can measure social values and then categorize into worldviews by virtue of an algorithmic computation. So we're moving towards the direction of measuring social values to identify which worldview you might be working from at a particular point in time.
Okay. May I add something to this?
Was there another question? Did you put your hand up? Okay.
The worldview issue, I think, is becoming increasingly interesting. In principle, you could take two approaches to that. Not many. One is this kind of create a typology. But there is an old book which I'm recommending again, 1919, The Psychology of Worldview, by a philosopher before he was a philosopher, when he was still a psychologist, Karl Jaspers. That book is translated in a few languages, I don't know how, but not in English. I think it's a good book. It's a long book, like always German, but the story basically is don't typologize. Think about how people get caught in any of these worldviews and how they might move between them. So it's a bit of nearly a biographical story rather than this kind of resonance frame that you're fixed like a personality. And I think that's a discussion we have in team, and I think that's where the discussion will go into the future. I think I think we have to recover this old problem of worldviews. It's particularly virulent in environmentalism and so on, where people do a lot handle the worldview problem, but all it comes down either in typologies or dimensionalities. So I think this is would be an interesting development to have nearly a biographical dynamics between the worldviews. But anyway, these are two
I think it's a question of accumulating evidence, to be fair.
Yeah, it's a bit like
when you typify like this, it's easier to make an argument than when you don't have the typology. But then when you demonstrate that the typology is underlined by dimensions, so it's a bit of a fluid typology, then, but to get there, you have to build up the evidence as you go along.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a program, research program.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So that's why we're moving into the values kind of measurement.
More questions?
Okay, part two, Martin.
Okay.
I was trying to make it quick to give you a little bit more space.
You always set the standard very high. I'm not sure whether I can follow your act here, but let me do this. So, Gordon raised the story as if there would be a kind of universal conclusion about engagement effect and mobilization effect. But what have we learned about Kuwait? And not much yet. Okay. And that's a bit of a dilemma with this kind of research. So here we are. This is our immersing team with the Sheikh of Kuwait in the middle, which is our old friend Mohammed Sardawi, who's a psychologist at the university. So he kind of opened this field. And this is a kind of, hopefully, at the beginning of a longer story as it develops. A key distinction we're working with is the scientific culture and the science culture. That's something I've been throwing into my world of public understanding of science for quite a while. The scientific culture is basically handled as how science is done, how universities are organized, how they are funded, how much they produce. So this is, generally speaking, a horse race between countries in the world. Publication effort, R&D investments, and you get these kind of figures here. And then you can find out where you are in the horse race. It's a kind of economic competition, okay? And you can see Kuwait is somewhere there. This is the Middle East, so to speak. And here is Kuwait, R&D expenditure, GDP per capita. This is a kind of economist type concern. That's not necessarily a social psychological concern. Our concern would rather be, if Kuwait is here, what does this actually mean in everyday life? And that's what we call the science culture. So the science culture is kind of backdrop with above which, so to speak, science as a superstructure is kind of built. And often people look for the science culture as support, but I also often look at sources of questioning, sources of raising controversy and raising questions. So, what do we know about Kuwait already? We had, in February, there was a report, before we finished our analysis, a report coming out as usual, global surveys. What does Kuwait think? We know Kuwait is part of the Middle East very much in relation to 4 questions related to the internet, which means artificial intelligence nowadays, medical research, environmental anxieties, and general view about technology. 4 indicators, and we can say there is generally a great ambivalence about science and technology. I'm not surprised, because that's generally also true in Europe. When you go to the southern end, the southeastern end of Europe, into Turkey, you get what we call an ambivalent relationship, odi et amo. I love science, and I'm very worried at the same time. This is not the case in Sweden or in the rest of you, where you have this breaking up. You either love it or you are worrying about it. So this ambivalent odi et amo, an old Latin poem, I hate it and I love it at the same time. I don't know why. So, 4 questions. The internet highly positive. This is kind of an enthusiasm about artificial intelligence. Obviously, Kuwait is a place where this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. Very optimistic about utility of medicine. I suspect there's even an attempt of placing Kuwait as a medical hub for the world. Go there to heal yourself. A lower environmental concern. Environment is not a concern in Kuwait as a kind of everyday life. But there's a high concern that actually technology will have a destructive impact on everyday life. So you see here the ambivalence between different issues. That's how we started. We also found an earlier research a few years ago, commissioned to the colleagues at NORC, which is the North American Research Organization, I think it's called, or something like that. They do general surveys in the United States, the GSS since the 1970s, an annual attitude survey. So they were commissioned to do that. We got hold of the material, and this is our report here, which Gordon has already introduced. So I will just focus on one particular enthusiasm of mine, which I brought to this project. Like Gordon brought the worldview, I brought this concern that when you measure attitudes to science, for 50 years we worried about it could possibly be too low, not enough support. I'm more worried about the higher end, and I think this is an unaccomplished part of the whole exercise of measuring attitudes. What is happening when we have very high support for science? And I call this technocracy tolerance. To such an extent, when you love somebody, when you so admire people, you want them also you want to defer them to govern you. It's a bit like when you are very religious, you want your religious leader to govern you. When you're very scientific, you want the scientists to govern. Unless you have some problems with this second step. Okay? So we're calling this technocracy tolerance, and we create in the European context Eurobarometer surveys. It's kind of multinational surveys you might know about. Got access to that. We created an index called TT100. This will be becoming a bit more public later this year, early next year. I don't have time to go into the details how we created the TT100, but 100 signifies European average, scaled to 100 and standard deviation 25, and then you get a kind of a measure to place different countries on this. It's basically made up of 4 intuitions, which in my view form a kind of a syllogism, a kind of a conclusion about where you place yourself. I have no option but to confide in technoscience. I agree with such a statement. Truth cannot arise from industry-funded research. It has to be public research. This is an old technocratic concern about vested interests. There is no use of wider participation in decision-making, so this kind of dismissal of democratic engagement. And we recognize the epistemic authority of science. Much of this scientists want to hear, except maybe the industry one not, and so on. Anyway, thus, therefore, me and my fellow citizens are TT, technocratic, technocracy tolerant, TT, technocracy tolerant. Bon. What do we know about this? A little bit of validation, just 2 attempts to validate. You have the TT 2021, which we constructed. I mean, this is going beyond our immediate project, but I'll come. And we have a Pew measure from the United States, and there seems to be a little bit of a correlation, placing countries here. But I'm particularly fond of this one, an independent research on technocratic classes, estimating the technocratic attitude in a population on a totally independent research by political scientists, and our own TT, and there's a very nice lineup in relation to these measures. So the question is, how is Kuwait on this? And we can place Kuwait with there's a slightly different index, just 36% is the index here, placing, this is basically disagreement bias agreement on this question. We have no option, which is part indicator. And you can see Kuwait is kind of in midfield, a little bit towards that more technocratically oriented, technocratically receptive, technocratically supported countries in the European Union. Correlations with that indicator in Kuwait now. So if you're technocratically minded in the UK, in Kuwait, you also think that scientists definitely know best, no question to ask about anything. They also have belief in the so-called myth of science, which is another index. Basically, myths of science are kind of old historical claims about science. Science should have no limits, particularly not moral ones. Science will provide to every possible problem in the world. Science will at some point provide a complete worldview. These are kind of things you find in old science history books or even philosophical statements. I call them the kind of myth of science. Very much people who endorse those items are also technocracy minded. People who have great expectations on the promises of science, what we call the utilitarian outcomes, will make our lives easier, healthier, more comfortable. Will create more jobs for young generations, more opportunities and so on. Very much correlated with TT, but also, and that's interesting in Kuwait, very highly correlated with concerns. Changes our life too fast, interferes with religious concerns, and so on. These are also highly correlated. You see, compared to France, you see the myth is much lower correlated, and the promise in Germany much lower correlated just as a comparison. So here's a bit of a nice complex in Kuwait, a strong correlation between this TT and the low best item, the deference item, the positive myth of science, and promise and reserve at the same time. This is how it stacks up a little bit. If you just look at cross tabulations, if you're older than 50, you're more likely to be TT. If you're retired also, if you have high income, if you work in the public sector. And Kuwait, what I learned from my little excursion there, Kuwait has an interesting structure. Most people are foreigners, but they're not allowed to live there and not allowed to retire. And most Kuwaitis work in the public sector, not in the private industry. So the immigrants work run the industry, and the locals work in the public sector, typically. Not 100% obviously, but typically, as far as I understand. I think that's correct. Yeah. So, as you see, Kuwaiti, very relatively high, and then you see the Arab expats are much less technocracy-minded in Kuwait itself. Yeah, you can see here, primary and secondary education makes you more technocratically minded. Higher education, I think, is a little bit lower, as far as I can see here. Religion, also, becoming more religious, also makes you more skeptical in relation to technocracy. What else can we say? Let's a little bit more comparison. So, in the EU, emerging evidence is 3 and more gradients. I just put in the gradients we can compare. So, in the EU, you have a gradient of age. In the EU, the older you are, clearly, the less technocracy tolerant you are in the UK, in the EU in general. That's not true country by country, but overall. The more educated you are, the less you are, and the more religious you are, the more technocracy tolerant you are as well. So religious authority somehow is transferred to scientific technological authority. There's no conflict between religiosity and scientific technological authority. In Kuwait, we have a very interesting curvilinear relationship with age, so the young and the older. The same with education, and then again this curvilinear interesting one, which is different from the European one, where you have the highest TT in the middle level of religiosity. So in principle, that's this classic, what I would say now, the conundrum. Why do we have this difference here? I don't know. So we need in principle now more research. And we have to ask Mohammed to come in and say we need more qualitative research to understand what we have here. We have clearly interaction effects between borders. Not a universal correlation of a regression on religiosity and TT, but as a matter of fact, very different figures on these relationships. I think it's an old axiom. I think Wolfgang, you exemplified that many times. The key point about representations is interaction effects, not main effects, when you compare different units of analysis. I can go a bit further. That's a complicated table. My evidence is now amassing about various countries from different surveys, Germany, UK, France. One can try to show a little bit how this stacks up, not in the same way. For example, here we are in Bretagne, and we know in France, Bretagne is a little bit more technocracy-minded than other regions in France, together with Normandy and Bourgogne. And so that's what I already said about Kuwait. It can get more complicated if you're religiously mobile, which means you're slightly different in your religiosity than your parents, either more or less. Then men are more TT than women, and women generally stay within the tradition in relation to their technocracy. So these are kind of fine-grained puzzles for us that we can find. Bon. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. So we are trying to create puzzles with the survey research to understand how the science culture peters out in a place like Kuwait. And for me, I have more questions rather than answers, but I'd like to understand why these things come up in this way and not in the kind of generalized straight line that we have as a European trend. But I can say also in Europe it gets more complicated. If you unfold this by region, 300 regions, or 50, 40 countries, 30 countries, you get very different correlations in different countries, which is actually an interesting puzzle. So, part of this science culture is how worldview creates a resonance for communication, but also how technocracy tolerance falls as an indicator in this particular part of the world compared to others. Well, this is an entry point for this culture of science. Good. Any questions? And obviously, Mohammed Sakki is also with us, but he couldn't be here. So, yeah. Any particular question?
I was just curious of a detail.
Sure.
I'm not sure that I have understood all the complexity of the scenario that you have drawn. But this intersection with the detail of immigrants who have a different path compared to native in Kuwait, you know? That is quite interesting because one of the questions also of our program that I'm going to present is who is the immigrant? Are we speaking to the same people or not? Because probably I will come later during presentation because if the immigrant is an academic rather than somebody who comes by boat and risks to die in the Mediterranean, we are speaking of different people.
No, of course, of course.
And this is what happened in Canada. You will see student, professor, and so these are the immigrants.
Of course, but here
in Kuwait, I don't know nothing about this culture. So
yeah, I mean this is basically the task which we've been given by the National Association for the Advancement of Science is to map out the science culture. But as I say here, I'm not reducing the science culture to the latest opinion poll. Science culture is more than that. But it gives you a kind of a picture, like taking photographs and raising puzzles. How is the science culture? And then you start comparing across. And in that comparison, the puzzle gets even stronger. So in principle, we are probably now in a phase to get some more qualitative analysis. And it would certainly be interesting to look into this particularity of the Gulf countries. Okay? Not sure how many experiences you have here in this room. The Gulf countries, they have this particularity. They're kind of tribal origin, but they expanded massively, and you can see that in the architecture. But this expansion is based on immigration, and the immigration is all temporary. It's very difficult to become a Kuwaiti. You're basically invited to leave again before you retire, but you made a lot of money, and this is very attractive. I have colleagues how to move to the United Arab Emirates, leave the university and get a career there. They're all building up, okay, in that sense. So that creates a particular society. And there's lots of description in political science what this means, in terms of political engagement and how political structure. So for me it would be interesting to see how a science culture is embedded in something like that. And there seems to be a difference between Kuwaitis and what we call Arab expats, or just on the level of this technocracy tolerance. It's a kind of a homegrown territory, but not necessarily those of the immigrants. So be interesting to do some more focus work. Yeah, sure.
Okay, any other questions, guys? Yeah, we need to make it quick because we need to move on.
Yes, I've never been to Kuwait, but my question is, what do you think, does it have something to do with distinctions between industrial and post-industrial societies? Once I read one paper written by John Durant, I think maybe some 10, 20 years ago, by your impression, is Kuwait more industrial? I mean, non-post-industrial society. So, what do you think? Is there some relation to that distinction?
I think it's a hard question to answer because of the stratification of society, but I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, what you're referring probably is the paper were arguing that in a post-industrial context,
I mean,
the relationship between knowledge and attitude.
yes. Actually, in this paper, as much as I remember, he wrote that in post-industrial societies, technological optimism is lower than in industrial societies. In that sense, sorry.
I mean, that could be a hypothesis. Okay? There was recently a paper in exactly asking this paper for Korea, okay? whether post-industrialism manifests itself in scientific attitudes of a particular patterning of positive, negative attitudes. Okay? And I think that's a good question. Post-industrialism is a kind of an economic historical category because you're comparing agricultural employment with industrial employment against service employment. I saw a beautiful figure recently about Switzerland, which clearly shows that it's no longer an industrial country because industrial employment has collapsed to 10% over the last 30 years, which is also true for Britain and other places. I don't know about Kuwait. I suspect they will be all service industry. That would be an economic question. But I think the post-industrial hypothesis could be, yeah, but I think there's more kind of, this is kind of Arab oil environment, which creates its own industry, its own structure. It's basically on oil. It's an oil-driven, and the economy. I mean, the far-sighting people in Kuwait, as far as I understand, they all want to get rid of the oil. What do you call it? Get rid of the mother breast. But that's very difficult for the country to get rid of the oil. So I think that's the real point, the underlying point.
Okay, well, thanks, Martin, again. We need to move on, so we've got 2 other presentations. No, stay right there. Okay, we have 2 presentations to go. So my first presentation is about this topic of integration. Okay, what does it mean to integrate people, as it were? And do we have a unitary concept of integration? Is it going to apply the same with everyone else? Yes?
We don't distinguish people by their nations or their religions or something like that.
Yeah, okay. So in its abstract sense, we could be talking like this. Applied to a particular locale, people might find issue with integrating particular people, right? So the presentation here today problematizes this representation of integration. There's also another bit of confusion when it comes to integration. A lot of people who talk about integration don't really mean integration. People on the street, what they mean is assimilation, right? So what they want when they say, migrants don't want to integrate, more often than not, what they mean is that migrants come here and they want to still do things their way. And they want the right to play their own music, cook their own food, dress their own attire, and that kind of thing, right? So there's this misnomer about integration. But the whole effort here isn't to try to solve public ignorance in any way, because ignorance is taken to be a representation. This is kind of what people understand by it. Now, what are we going to do? How are we going to handle it? Because if we don't handle it one way or another, right, then things risk boiling over. And we don't want things to boil over, so this is the effort. So coming at this from a social representations approach, just observing in society that society is made up of different groups, and some of them kind of seem to like one another, and some of them seem to dislike one another, right? How do we kind of get a grip on this kind of problem? This is what I have been involved in for quite a long time. The starting problem for me is this, right? It's not Islamophobia. If you ask the Maltese about the Muslims, okay, they're not scared of them. There's no fear. They don't like them. the Maltese do not like Arabs, Muslims. And when they mean Arabs, they don't mean the Kuwait and Gulf states, they mean Libya more often than not, and a little bit of Tripoli, because that is who the Arab is, that is who the Muslim is in Malta. And they refer to them in the same way that the Italians will talk about the Moroccans and the Libyans, or that the French will talk about the Algerians. Because they're getting these kinds of ideas and these representations, these ways of framing the particular other, right, from what they're experiencing online and what they're reading on the social media and so on and so forth, and they will attribute and level the same stereotypes. But the problem starts when we measure this integration potential, right, in these surveys that try to predict particular attitudes, and the Arab group over a 10-year period comes out in negative territory by every other group, okay? So we did a study 10 years apart, and we were asking every socio-ethnic category in Malta, the dominant Maltese, but also others, Western Europeans, Eastern Europeans, Africans, Asians, East Asians, right? We were asking them, to what extent do you like or dislike these various other categories, between 0 and 100, with 50 marking the point between a negative attitude and a positive attitude. And the Arab group comes out the lowest on both time intervals, and the only group that hasn't made any progress, and the only group that is rated negatively by every other group. So you can just imagine how tough life is if you happen to be Arab Muslim in Malta. Nobody likes you. There isn't one other group that is expressing positive regard or a kind of positive inclination towards you if you're Arab Muslim. Now, what are those conditions? We know from social psychology, people don't kind of accept stigma unproblematically, they're kind of inclined to react to it. So if you keep, leveling these negative attitudes at people, where are you going to end up? They're going at some point to fight back, and perhaps legitimately so, and that is how social conflict is going to erupt. So we wanted to study this a little bit further because we didn't have... Now, let me just... flag up that Malta has a long-standing trade relation with the Arab countries, okay? A lot of the GDP is generated by trading with other Arab countries. It's at the crossroads of the Mediterranean. There's a lot of transshipment that happens through Malta. If you look at me, I could pass for an Arab, right? So there's a lot of genes that are coming from the traffic, and the Arabs, amongst many other colonizers, were in Malta the longest, and they left the least legacy. They left the laws untouched, and it was the most peaceful time in Maltese history. So much so that we've forgotten about it completely. The Moors were there, right? The Saracens. They didn't build much, they didn't change the laws in any way, they didn't infiltrate anything other than the local language, okay? So if you hear me speaking Maltese to another Maltese person, you think it's Arabic. It isn't, and the Arabs consider it an Arabic dialect, but it isn't. But we also write it using Roman letters, okay? So it's particular in this sense. But yeah, so there's a kind of strong presence that the Maltese are apt to kind of deny in a certain sense. Why? Because they want to distinguish themselves from the Arabs and they want to pass for Europeans, right? This is the kind of identity dilemma that the Maltese experience. So coming at this from social representations perspective, one would typically ask, what is the social representation of Arabs, right? And then we'd ask different people, and some people will tell us, oh, we represent the Arab this way, and then some other people will represent the Arab this way. But I don't think that does justice to the topic. Because if we take social representations as something that pertains to particular groups, right, then the social representation that you end up with isn't something that falls from the sky into your lap, and then you can, oh, this is the social representation of Arabs that I have, so I need to ascribe to it, right? No. Well, the social representation, my thinking is this: the social representation of Arabs that the Maltese have is a particular social representation that the Maltese have fashioned over time for particular purposes. It serves the purposes of the project that the Maltese are signing up to, to be a European nation. And if you want to be a European nation, then you most certainly cannot be Arab. Look at what happens to Arab countries and the treatment they're receiving from European countries. So instead of foregrounding the representation of the Arab, we are foregrounding the relations that are entailed in the particular project of integrating the object of inquiry. Okay, so we're kind of reformulating the social representations effort. Instead of studying social representations of Arabs, we're studying social representations for integration that are held by the Maltese when they represent the Arabs. See what I mean? So we're extending the formula. So how do we do this? How do we study it? We adopt an argumentation analysis procedure. So this is how we did the interviews, right? So we went into the field with the Maltese and we said, okay, what do you think about the integration of Arabs in Europe? Foregrounding the project rather than the object. This, in an argumentation analysis, gives you the claim. It's a good idea, or it's a bad idea. They'll just give you the claim. You can drop it there, but then you can ask why. And if you ask why, what you get in argumentation terms is evidence and warrants. Oh, it's a good idea because we make a lot of money by trading with them. Our GDP has gone up significantly after the euro through trade with Arab countries. So we should integrate them. They're giving you the reasons. Or it's a bad idea because it introduces in Malta the kind of diversity that we do not want to introduce. So we adopt this argumentation analysis protocol in conducting the interviews and analyzing the data that comes from the interviews to study the social representation of the project of integration by the Maltese of the Arabs and also by the Arabs of integration entailing the object of the Maltese. So we went and did studies with the Maltese about the Arabs to understand the source of the antipathy, but we also wanted to understand how do the Arabs perceive and experience this kind of situation. So we asked Arabs what they thought of the prospect of integration in Malta, given what the Maltese think about the Arabs. So the social representation of Arabs is across the groups, right? But it's being developed and fabricated and deployed differently towards what might be a contested project. Okay, we use the minimal model of argumentation, which I have just outlined, and the idea here is to develop an ecological argumentation framework, okay? I'm calling it ecological because this makes sense in a particular context. If you take this out of this context, then the evidence that's going to be used, the warrants that are being leveled are going to be completely different. So you might find the same stereotypes in the south of France as you do in Italy, as you do in Malta, in terms of stereotypes, but the justification for the stereotypes is going to be local. So this makes sense to people who are immersed in that particular environment. So we're not treating the problems from an international relations perspective, we're dealing with the problem at the local relations perspective. This is the aspiration. So what do we do? What do we find? Okay, so in practical terms, okay, we do a series of interviews with the Maltese and we do a series of interviews with the Arabs. Across the board, we find that there are some Maltese who are racist and who think integrating Arabs is a really bad idea. You don't want these people around and we should find ways and means to kick them out of this country and to not let them in. The only people we should be integrating are Europeans. But then we also find Maltese, others, who will argue integrating Arabs is one strength that this country has over any other European nation. We are a country that has never had any problems with the Arabs. We've never had terrorist attacks in this country, and that is because we can deal with them in a way that other Europeans, with their superiority complexes, cannot. We are sensitive to what's happening, and because of that, Europe needs to learn from us how to deal with the Arabs. So let's integrate them so that we can go on and offer a European solution ourselves to what is becoming a European problem based in colonial traditions. That's on the Maltese side of things. You go to the Arab side of things, and you find once again a diversity. So some Arabs will argue, yes, integration is a really good idea, and some Maltese are racist, but most of them are welcoming. So we want to make the best out of the integration prospects, and we want to learn to get along with the Maltese, because if we're here, we can contribute to this society, and if we contribute to this society, then we all live together well, and we become a beacon of hope for other Arab migrants elsewhere. Then there are also Arabs who tell you, the Maltese are crazy, man, you know. Look at what they're doing with their time. They're smoking weed, they're drinking alcohol, you know. These guys have completely lost it, and this is a really bad place. We don't want to integrate here. We want to keep our traditions and then piss off at the first opportunity as soon as things settle down at home. This is just something we have to suffer and endure in the process. So what do you find really and truly? You find diversity amongst the Maltese, and you find diversity amongst the Arab communities, right? Okay, that's what qualitative research gives you. Okay, now the question is, what's the proportion, right? Typically, this is what it is. How many Maltese are subscribing to pro, how many Maltese are subscribing to anti, how many Arabs to pro, how many Arabs to anti. But we're armed at this point with a whole list of claims that have been made by the Maltese and the whole list of claims that have been made by the Arabs. So we bring them together in a thematic analysis. And what we do here is we retain only those that recur. Because some arguments that the Maltese have made appear also in the Arab corpus, and some arguments that the Arabs have made appear in the Maltese corpus. So we keep only those claims that have recurred, because these resonate across the intergroup divide. But these also go from pro-integration to anti-integration, whatever integration means. The point here isn't the social representation of integration. The point here is the social representations for integration. So how are they constructing the integration experience? Now, I'm just going to give you two examples of two claims, one pro, one anti, that recur across the divide. So you'll see what I'm talking about. So this is a pro-integration claim. Both Arabs and Maltese have come to the conclusion that the Maltese and Arabs can definitely get along whilst fully keeping their cultural and religious differences. Living together is highly beneficial. The Maltese justify this on the premise that we never had problems with Arabs, we get along with them on a daily basis, and unlike abroad, there are no problems here. Also, Arabs are okay and pleasant to deal with. Some of them are really polite, and some of them are very highly educated. The Arabs, however, will argue integration is the only option. It is necessary for amicable coexistence and for mutual dialogue and respect. The Maltese are kind-hearted and welcoming. The Maltese welcome migrants, and for example, they are generous towards migrants. So it's a pro-integration claim that resonates across the group divide. Okay, it's not all good news. Racism between the Maltese and Arabs makes sense. We simply should not mix. The Maltese will tell you Arabs are notorious, they threaten others, and they're known for bad intentions, whereas the Arabs will tell you that the Maltese are greedy, they exploit the Arabs, and they're obsessed with money. Right? So the question is, so you end up then with a list of these, right, with arguments on both sides. So in a next exercise, we then ranked these claims alone from the most pro-integration claims to the most anti-integration claims to understand, you know, to get a bit of an ecological scale of what people think. And this is what we end up with. We end up with 6 claims that are pro-integration and 6 claims that are anti-integration that have been ranked by experts as more or less pro-integration and more or less anti-integration. So, for instance, the least pro-integration claim is, as with other cultures, cultural contact between Maltese and Arabs can be good in some respects. A step up. As a minimum, there should be no discrimination. Up. Maltese and Arabs can definitely get along whilst fully keeping their cultural traditions. See what I mean? So an increasing intensity of integration here. And we have the same here, a decreasing anti-integration sentiment. The religious and cultural differences between Maltese and Arabs can be problematic. when it comes to living together can be problematic. Migrants would do well to keep certain cultural practices private in order to get along. All the way to racism between Maltese and Arabs makes perfect sense. We should not mix. So you can see how this scale grows from the most pro-integration to the most anti-integration in a scaled fashion, okay? A little bit like Thurstone scaling here, okay? We're ranking the items. And then we present this to people and tell them, to what extent do you agree or disagree with this one? To what extent do you agree or disagree with this one? So we're combining Likert scaling and Thurstone scaling to get an idea of how this is spread in public opinion. And then this is what we find. So look at this. These are the Maltese views on integration and the Arab views on integration, and we've regressed them, right? So you can see that on the item that is only slightly pro, there's a convergence. Above the slightly pro, the Arabs are more integrationist than the Maltese. Below the slightly pro, the Maltese are a bit more anti-integrationist than the Arabs. The Arabs are the least on the anti-integration items. Now, this is a finding that has been replicated all over the world. Typically, the dominant group is less integrationist than the immigrant groups. Immigrant groups tend to favor integration more than the dominant groups. Dominant groups tend to favor assimilation more than integration. So this doesn't really tell us much other than there's a convergence of agreement on this statement. The slightly pro. Okay, might be useful. We didn't stop here though. We gave the same items, right, that we asked of the Maltese and the Arabs to the same groups and asked them, what do you think the other thinks? In other words, we asked the Maltese, what do you think the Arabs are going to answer on these items? And we told the Arabs, what do you think the Maltese will answer on these items? So here's what's interesting. The regression line for the Maltese views here and the Arab views, this is Arab attributions to the Maltese, and this is what the Maltese actually think. The Arabs seem to have a good sense of where the Maltese are. You can see that the line follows the same pattern. It increases for integration, right, for the both of them. Only the Arabs are misperceiving, as it were, the integrationist potential that the Maltese are actually showing. They're underrating it a little bit, right? But you can see that the pattern remains the same, right? The attributions are increasing upwards. It's the slope that's different. What about what the Arabs think and what the Maltese are thinking the Arabs think? That is where the lines are completely different. So the blue is what the Maltese are attributing to the Arabs. The Maltese are attributing to the Arabs much higher anti-integration sentiment, much lower integrationist sentiment. There's a convergence here in the middle for the slightly anti-integrationist view. There was a convergence earlier for the slightly pro-integrationist view, right? So if we're pinpointing where the discrepancies lie, it's right here. There's no point in any intervention that promotes integration with the Maltese. They already support integration. There's no point in trying to convince the Arabs that integration is a good thing. They already also support integration. The problem exists in the attributions that the Maltese are making to the Arabs. The Arabs are thinking, the Maltese are thinking that the Arabs do not want to integrate when they do. This is a misperception of what's happening amongst the Arab community. The Maltese are misperceiving the Arab intent. And so, as a locus for intervention, or at least that's what our recommendations were, if you're wanting to do anything, then you need to do two things. You need to find a statement on which the two communities agree, so that when you communicate the statement, you get a yes and a yes, rather than a yes and a no, right? You need to communicate that using the argumentation structure of the particular group. You can't sell integrationist Maltese claims to the Arabs using Maltese justifications. You need to use Arab justifications, so that's why it's important to use claims that recur across the intergroup divide. And you also, if you're wanting to fix anything here, you need to address the Maltese misunderstandings rather than Arab intent. And you do it, how? By taking an item on which they agree and then building up support one step at a time. You bring them on board and you preach to the converted, you get them on board first, and then thereafter you scale it up. The bad news is that in the hands of a malicious player, one could also scale things down and work in the other direction, right? But that is kind of how things are, that's how the scale operates and that's how it works. Going back to social representations theory, what we've done is articulate what we're calling the pass method for reconciliation, right? Why is it pass? It foregrounds the project. This goes back straight to your Toblerone model, Martin, right? Foregrounding the project and conceiving of social representations that's fashioned in functional terms to sustain particular projects. This is how social representations evolve over time. Not because new meanings happen out of the blue, but because people want to represent the meaning that they've already subscribed to adapt better to arising and changing circumstances. So we foreground the project, we look at the argumentation structures that sustain particular social representations, we scale those arguments to get a sense of how things vary across a population, and then we survey to find instances of alignments or misalignments in the social representations that people are fashioning for the purpose of sustaining projects. And all of that, there's a whole bunch of papers that we've written on this, but thankfully I've got a book coming out in October later this year where all of this is broken down into a lot more detail, so if anyone is interested in reading further, then this is the place to go. Thank you very much for your attention.
Quick question. Did you consider any age range of the participants when you ask the questions? Because to me, it's always differentiated between adolescents and adults.
So we went only for adults. We didn't have access to kids. It was very hard to reach the Arab community. More so than age, we had an issue with gender, because to get access, so we had a Maltese researcher who learned Arabic to be able to speak to the local community. We were able to get males without any problem, but to get access to females on their own without the presence of a male supervising the interview proved to be a little bit difficult. That said, this was undertaken at a time when the whole Syrian problem was very salient and there were a lot of Syrian refugees coming to Malta, so it was a bit of a sensitive time to be doing this research. If we were to do it again today, I would anticipate that we'd face less problems than we did back then. But I would say the particular socio-demographic category that proved most difficult in undertaking the research was gender rather than age.
And how many they were?
So for the interviews we had 60, and for the quant, if I remember well, something like 150 around, something like that. On Cody?
Your scale on both sides, did you consider if there might be a middle ground between assimilation as it's described, complete total collapse of your structures into the other structure, and integration. There seems to be a lot of confusion and debates about what each of these items mean. There was a debate in the UK recently about halal meat, which was imported by Islam, and then came the debate about kosher meat, which is also different, and then the whole thing seems to be collapsing. Are we going to remain on both ends, or is there a room for? There's in history, if we go back, there's some work I've been doing with Martin. If you go back in history, you'll find there's always this mix of cultures where it becomes some kind of middle ground.
Yeah.
You bring a bit of this, you bring a bit of that, and then that becomes the...
Okay, so just to move on, because I don't have much time. So we didn't consider assimilation because these are terms that crop up in the literature, but they don't crop up with the people when you talk to them about these kinds of issues. Nobody talks about assimilation. You don't find it in the newspapers. It doesn't crop up in interviews. Assimilation is not an issue. The issue is, do they want to integrate? Do we want to give them the space to integrate? Giving them the space to integrate means banning or otherwise the burqa, banning or otherwise and the building of a new mosque, and that kind of thing. What they're expected to do to integrate, they're expected to remove the hijab, they're expected to not observe the Muslim festivities, and so on and so forth. The only community that presents any issue in Malta is the Muslim community. There's no debate about kosher, there's no debate about Jews, there's no debate about any other denomination. Bear in mind, it's a very small country, and it's not a major international player on anything other than the atrocious Eurovision Song Contest and Malta's entry there. Passport, yes. But we got rammed. We got a slap on the wrist by the European Commission. So, in a sense, it's like I'll confess. In a sense, it's like looking at a goldfish bowl. It might not be good enough to get a sense of what's happening in the ocean, but it gives you a bit of an insight of what can be done in particular circumstances. My answer to that question is that these complexities require complex solutions, and one way to do it is to break it down into the manageable elements. So I would say if one has a problem with integrating Jewish diasporas, and then they also have a problem with integrating Muslim communities, well, then you're going to have to do this twice. I don't see a way of one behavioral scale encompassing all of that diversity. Wolfgang, and then Sarah, and then we'll have to.
Very simple. I knew your model before, of course, but listening to your presentation really showed that it is the best model that I've ever heard about how to investigate intergroup relations. Really, I love it. The other thing is, can you go back to the graphs? Was the shape of this nearly synovial curves. Doesn't this indicate that your experts may have confused some of the positions of the arguments? I mean, how can you have such a shape of a scale that's supposed to be a scale that looks like random?
Yeah, well, you do have, the regression line is rising, and the pattern is rising mostly, but yeah, there is a lot of variation. I don't have a quick answer to it. It might be. It might be the case that the nuances are too close.
Who were the experts?
So they were mostly academic experts working in the domain. Social
Arab,
scientists.
Arab or
mostly Maltese and Europeans.
Well, see, there is.
Yeah, there could be. Yeah. I wouldn't exclude it, and in that case, I think a deeper exercise might be warranted. This is what we could do under the circumstances with the funds that we have available, and so on and so forth. Sarah?
I really like your model so much. I have two small questions. One is about what if it's not a misunderstanding of the Maltese, but there are things, but it's a justification of and kind of anti-integration position. They do not want.
But that would have come out here, Sarah. We would have found it here. This slide is what represents the Arab views and the Maltese views. So this tells you what the communities are thinking.
Okay, but it's the Maltese views on the integration.
Yeah.
It's a kind of polite. I would like that they integrate, but they do not want to integrate.
Yeah, that is. So I would like that they integrate is here. They do not want to integrate is here.
Yeah.
So I don't see any. It's the same pattern, right? But what the Arabs want is this. What the Maltese think the Arabs want is this.
Okay.
So this is where the study reveals that the Maltese are attributing higher anti-integration sentiments and lower integration sentiments to the Arabs than what the Arabs are actually reporting. I think what might have been an issue here is social desirability. That might have been a factor. The Arabs think this is what the Maltese researchers want to hear from us, so let's tell them, you know, we want to integrate. That is an open question, and maybe there is scope to investigate that further, but yeah, I think that is what might be lurking under those findings if we were to take a critical stance.
And my second question is related to the, you know, you said this project of Maltese want to be European, which means doesn't want. Does this change, or can be changed through this kind of integration project that you propose here? Or it doesn't change really this narrative of being European without?
I don't know. I think it's a thorny point in Maltese identity, you know. The fact that we're between Europe and Africa means that, you know, we could be leaning one way or another. Over time, I'm not just the only one who has reported an ambivalent identity for the Maltese and a kind of aspiration for the Maltese to be European. And this helps them develop distinctiveness in their identity and a sense of superiority, as it were, or a sense of self-esteem. And the side effect of that is that there's a distancing from our Arab neighbors, and we don't want to be perceived as Arab, and therefore, you know, this is grounds for justifying antipathy towards the Arabs. Can it be changed, and in what way? I think it's a bit of a million-dollar question, because it's an ambivalent identity as well, you know. In my own research, I found that the Maltese consider themselves superior to Europeans in many ways, but also inferior to Europeans in many ways, and the positives tend to cancel out the negatives. Realistically, being Maltese, embedded in Malta myself, I don't see a kind of aspiration to ameliorate relations with the Arabs. There's a lot of sympathy for the Palestinian cause right now, but it's a little bit of a kind of extending the hand of charity rather than allowing ourselves to change in a determined direction. Because we then don't want to encounter a Northern European and be identified as the Arabs of Europe. That we don't like. Okay. If you're asking me a question, you're taking it of your own time.
I will take my own time because my presentation will be not so interesting as both the previous two. Because, yeah, it's different oriented. But anyway, I start from the curiosity that she already mentioned about because, and all the question indeed was anticipated, try to also understand in this just one word, Arab, and one word, Maltese, who are the real people. For example, I was wondering what are the social life of the children of these Arab. These Arabs are not just there, they decided to come, no? Are not refugees or something. Or
yeah, there are a lot of refugees.
So the problem is who they are, indeed, in order to diversify. For example, are the Arab children being included in the same school, setting school of the Maltese, or they have their own? This is a lot of a question.
Yeah, so what I can tell you what the situation is right now. So there used to be in the past school for Muslims and Arabs, but that was shut down following the unrest in Libya, and there wasn't a sizable community in Malta for a very long time, so that we don't really have at this point in time second generation and third generation. Their second and third generation are only just coming of age, so nobody has really taken up the kind of bicultural identity project, as it were, and to try to push for integration in that sense. What we typically have is Libyans, Syrians, Tunisians coming to Malta mostly for work purposes, and then either staying there because they can't go back because of the unrest in their country, or they maybe fall in love, marry, and start a family, but the kids are still very young and they face a lot of stigma when they go to school because your parent is a Muslim or your parent is an Arab, and you know.
Which language do they speak?
So the parents typically speak Arab, Farsi typically, right? But there's a whole diversity, obviously, Syrians and Libyans.
Farsi is different than Arab.
Yeah.
I'm talking Farsi, and you know that most
So what I know
people
about
think that Arab and Persian are the same, but
Okay.
they're different.
So what I know about this is that people who speak Farsi understand, so they get it. So a conversation between Maltese and the Farsi speaker, they can totally understand what's going on. So sometimes that helps with integration, although the Maltese can't understand two Arabs talking between them, regardless of whether it's Arabic or Farsi or anything else. So language is still a barrier, and the Arabs in Malta pick up the Maltese language very quickly to be able to speak it. So if you get a Bolt driver who speaks any dialect of Arabic, they can pick up the Maltese very quickly. But writing it and using it to get jobs, employment, schooling, and that kind of thing is still a problem, because they don't have those kinds of linguistic skills that one would obtain through education. So are there enough opportunities for current Arab migrants, first generation Arab migrants, to integrate seamlessly? Very difficult. Not if they can't speak English, not if they're not westernized in their ways of doing things, in their cultural kind of engagement. Those who would have received some form of English education, those who wear jeans like the locals do and that kind of thing, they have better prospects. But, you know, the Maltese can still pick them out. Just like they can pick out Eastern Europeans or Asians or anyone else. That's what the situation is. But we haven't come to the point of second generation and third generation yet. Yeah.
The island is indeed a social laboratory, no?
Yeah. Okay, final presentation of the day.
Ready to sleep will be not so exciting because, I'm not joking. I want to just tell you that I was just to be in time, want to be in time to not have any remark. I cut all the slides related to the result. And I decided just to present the title of the 20 chapters that are going to are included in this forthcoming book. But I had a breakfast with Lilian Negura, who is one of the co-author, who play a fundamental role, because all the second part of the book, as you are going to learn, is based on the extension of what I call the mother research, on which I have worked several academic years with more than 300 of students who deliberately decided to attend the research laboratory in my courses, that the social representation was, maybe not, no more, I'm retired, social representation and communication. And so all there were organized in a small group, no more than 8 people. So there were so many that I had to ask the Aula Magna to organize it. It was an intensive research laboratory. Once these 3 years is finished, we prepared a joint project with Canada, where I am a joint professor, and our project has been selected and financed. So I have continued to work on this topic. That's has changed my project for my retirement. I wanted just to work on meta-theoretical analysis on the book of a biography of a theory. So now I'm going to present mostly the title, but after the breakfast with Lilian, I decided that all the some of the hidden slides presenting some result probably is better to present them. Now that means probably time is not respected. Yes, but no problem if we can. And there is the opportunity for the few people who can be interested at the end to read the book. Alors, indeed, the title of the presentation is exactly the title of the book, Social Representation of Immigrant or Migrant. There are two different words and two different representations. Migrant gives the idea of circularity. Immigrant can be the invader. And the field and multimedia studies across the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. Now, so as I told, this presentation is just aimed at presenting the book structure and the different 20 chapters. It's quite a long book, and will be published by Springer in a special series that I like very much for the previous book that has been published there, called Culture and Policy Making, the Symbolic Universes of Social Action. It's an edited series by Sergio Salvatore, it was just mentioned by Gordon, Terry Mandarini, Valsiner, and Bestri. There will be a foreword of Maurizio Ambrosini that, despite I've read so much of the literature, I discovered quite recently, and is different from me, that I've moved from many different research topics, but with an epistemic key related to social representation, theory, and communication. Ambrosini has worked all his life. He's a professor from Milan University that I have known quite recently. Has worked all his life on migration with a very inclusive approach that I like very much, that is oriented to policy. No? So if we learn something from our study, how we can contribute in policy action, that for me, provide an additional value of the work. And that's why I invited him to make the preface to this book. So these are the leader of the research team that are behind, that can be hundreds of students or just a few doctoral students, but you will see their name when they are mentioned. And in the acknowledge, I acknowledge in the book all the students who have contributed, because students are introduction. So also because this editorial format that obliges the editor of the book to follow some schema, for example, was not possible to make just a foreword and a preface, but the chapter 1 that initially was conceived as the first chapter of the part 1 for editorial format was important to present as an introduction. And so I have changed everything, because I don't want to present only my own chapter, but an introduction to all book. And in the preface, I limited to present the structure that is organized in 3 parts. So this is the part 1. The part 1 is what I call the mother research, because really it's generated father research. And this father research are, as I already mentioned, about this joint transnational and even transcontinental research team that we have organized. One, the project presented in Canada has been approved. I was just in the month between retirement and not, and so I also decided to live in Canada. Luckily, I left my funds in Canada rather than in La Sapienza, where people are not more than academic, are also thieves. So Part 1, the mother research as a background of transcontinental comparative study. Basically, the mother research is organized in, I say, two big lines. One is field studies, and the other one is on multimedia studies. Multimedia also means multi-channel, not only different media, but a different way to express. So, what about this field study? First of all, I designed a new technique because I believe that this migration experience, especially for those who come from the other side of the Atlantic, people don't come to Italy like in Canada, by flying, as sometimes immigrants are professors. Lilia Negura is from Moldova, is considered an immigrant. But the immigrants who arrive in Italy, if they arrive, because the Mediterranean has become a sort of sea of death, as also Francis Pope, who made an interesting meeting in Malta some years ago, that he believed that is a sort of a joint territory between Africa and Europe. Who are these immigrants and how to get their narrative? Because it is a very traumatic experience for most of them, as you will see. So I decide always to recur to my clinical background to use a more projective way. And first of all, to let people not just speak with you, looking in your eyes or making an interview, like an exam, just to let them speaking while they drawing. So I invented this technique of drawing your travel experience, narrating it in a certain sense. Drawing while storytelling the migratory travel experience, a new figurative technique inspired by the modeling approach to social representation. And in the third chapter, we present, in the first I presented the technique basically, just with some example. It's finished already or not?
No, you have 10 minutes.
Okay. So, the third chapter, figurative textual verbal narrative about the migratory experience from home, transit to the destination country, even in the technique for the drawing, if you imagine to come back. Because it's a difference if you don't imagine to come back, or if you just travel with the idea that you will stay forever there. And so, this different channel, figurative, textual, is different if you write and if you speak. And who, from home, transit to the destination country, first and second generation of adult and adolescent, immigrant or for family reunification. Do you know there is a great, very articulated typology of who are, even from the legal point of view, the immigrant. But we also call immigrant. There are, for example, immigrant for family reunification is completely different typology. But at the end, this category, legal category, are completely different. This is just one of the examples that touched me so much. These are young people from Philippines, already in Italy, and so it's also very much important to know for each subject how long, because it's completely different. And so, look, here, the girls who are just relaxed. This is Philippines. This is Italy, just studying. And of course, not only drawing, there are also associative network and figurative technique integrated by storytelling that has been also classified, and contextual socio-demographic interview, also speaking about, for example, the network of relations they have in Italy, but also they keep or not keep in the country of origin, no? Because you can stay in Italy and be close in the Philippine community, or you can stay in Italy and to have Italian friends. It's a completely different scenario. And also the social practice, no? What they, the food that they like and so on. And now just to read you to, my life at the moment has been about studies, which is stressful and tiring, missing my dog and the happier life back in Philippines. And so you have here also polarity index. Now, if I go into detail, I will not go on. So I'm sorry, I have to leave you some curiosity. But if we move from children, first and second generation, this study was conducted in Italy. On the contrary, this study has been conducted in Germany on migrants from 32 countries, from 4 continents. And I, for this presentation, just selected 2 that they have one common point. There are from Africa, but we have from many continents. And as you see here, this is the prospective scenario of coming back. But look at this point. I use the color as a symbol to express different emotions. So courage, happy, horror, patient, afraid, safe, and so on. Libya. Libya is horror. And this is another, this is a very simplified drawing indeed. It's a more the trajectory. But the real technique of drawing while you're traveling is also asking to put symbols that are very important for you from the country of origin and country of destination, and potentially where you do want to go, if they imagine to move data. Just to show you the common point, no? One from Somalia, the other was completely opposite side of Africa, but the horror point is Libya. And one of the protagonists of the horror in Libya has been welcomed by Meloni government that allow him to go back to Libya with the plane of government rather than have already a international mandate for being in prison. What about the other chapter? Probably here I will give it to see. Let me do like that. 5 minutes? Okay. Just the title of the other chapter. First of all, the sources for the multimedia channel media studies were very different articulated. Scientific discourse. I had a question. But is this literature that on migration less polarized than the media discourse by politicians, journalists, and lay people? Are so this representation at the end so polarized as this is a transversal result that we found about the discourse by politicians, journalists, and lay people? And the answer, just a quick answer, is no, it's less polarized, luckily. Inclusive, exclusively narrative and dichotomic metaphor about migratory flow by multi-agents of the policy and action-driven institutional discourse. I will show just a table that you will see what are these institutional discourse, because it is important not only to have political leader, but also, and this is related with the institutionalization that oriented the policy at the end. So you have to study the different law in different countries. Paola Castro would be happy, but she's not here. So And so the institutionalized discourse, which is also oriented the policy. But we also studied the echo chamber of anti-pro-immigrant political leader view in Italian online newspaper and TV broadcaster. Here I focus on Italian, but indeed we had also analysis from US, and the sources are also international, this institutional one, because otherwise, anyway. The other chapter is about the social media. So Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube as arena for political propaganda. At the beginning, I believe that this was the voice of the citizen. But this social media has become a tool, regular tool for political propaganda. Now, even in Italy, especially from Salvini, but I think the President of the United States immediately writes on his own. Anyway, Twitter is no more Twitter, as you know, but at that period it was Twitter. And, you know, one of the Christmas I went to see this film as a sort of cadeau pour moi, a gift for me, that finally I do something for myself. And I saw this film called Io Capitano, that has gained a lot of international premium, was also candidate for the Oscar. And I thought, why I should try this book? It is enough to see this film, to watch this film. And this is the title of this chapter that the final I included. Could be just this, from dreaming migrant to protagonist actor, polarized social representation of immigrants as a filter of the impact of eye-chapter film, Io Capitano, from comment to YouTube official trailer. To understand that how this film became also a research line, I analyzed all the comments on the YouTube to the official trailer of the film, because I couldn't interview people how I was already retired, so as for all my life I was organized, involved in students, that gave me the passion also, contributed to the passion for the research. No, this was, but why is so interesting? Because the film is incredible. Is the real story of immigrants who dreaming to arrive, and you couldn't say the intersection between the narration about Libya, concentration camp, and the narrative we got through the student. Finish the time. 1 minute. That's why I didn't want to present any results. So you will keep this. You just see that it's more than 10,000 sources. And these are just the trailer of Io Capitano. These are signs of the film. And let's see at least 2 words about second part of the book, which is based on the extension, not of all the research line, because we had a transcontinental research team of very few people. So the research line was about institutionally policy-driven discourse, and including also NGO, which is an interesting joint point, because otherwise Italy, Europe is very polarized in pro-against, and Canadian is much more inclusive, but inclusive whom? Who are the immigrants? They appear student, professor, people who contribute. They have also worker, but not the worker with no legal status as in Italy or something like that. Anyway, black, go on. The second part also includes a last chapter. With now this is all chapter articulating the result from Italy and Canada. And so we select from the library that I've built, that has now a special section about the immigration study. Okay, I stop here, but let's go to the just to mention the colleague on the third part.
We're looking forward to read that book. We're looking forward to read that book. We're really looking forward to that.
Yeah, maybe bring us a slide.
Yeah.
Of part 3.
Because I have not to have the breakfast with with Lilian, who told me no, people will be bored just to have the title of the chapter. No? But the title of the third part, just to mention the contribution of the colleague, otherwise I feel guilty also. No? So there is another added chapter by Lilian Negura that is interesting because it's about Moldova. He is from Moldavia, and the understanding of the Moldovan immigration experience in Canada. So for me it's interesting because it's a meta-reflection also by Lilian Negura. And the second is from Susanna Seidman, who also participated in this conference, as migratory movement and discrimination in the press in Argentina, the case of access to health in the province of Zhuhai, if I pronounce better. I asked Susanna and Lilian to be here to present themselves this, but they, for different reasons, Lilian is now following the student presentation, and Susanna fall down, I thumbs out, and she the other side, and she had a problem. And so, and there is another contribution from a Brazilian University Federal de Santa Catarina, Florianopolis, with a student from there, Andrea Giacomozzi, who were supposed to come, Marielli Mezzari Vitali, who also has an affiliation with Aix-en-Provence, moved there, Anderson Silveri, another doctoral student, Marcos Vinicius, difficult for me to pronounce, you can know. Ethical dilemma about immigration in the political speech of a Brazilian president, because it's fundamental, the geopolitical positioning is the most important variable. The most important is, and see, become a sort of, I could say, transversal, almost independent the cultural context. I make the analysis of all the discourse of Trump, finito, ma l'ultimo è from Africa. From Africa, evaluation of South African policy makers, media representation of illegal migrants in township from Karabo, from South Africa, and now from Pretoria. So at least I've mentioned all the quotes.